associate professor of Russian, and who also directs the Russian Studies program at Iowa State University. Her research interests include post-Soviet Russian cinema, television, performance, and popular literature, as well as communicative humanistic approaches to language pedagogy. And she's the author of Kina Talk, 21st Century, through Routledge 2020, Faces of Contemporary Russia, through Georgetown University Press 2019, and Kinotalk, Russian Cinema for Conversation, published through Slavica Publishers in 2006. And her other publications have appeared in Slavic and East European Journal, the Russian Review, Canadian Slavonic Papers, and Kinokultura. And I wanted to remind you that today's webinar is one of the webinars of the complete series of webinars offered by the ACTR this semester, and it is dedicated to teaching language through standards. And hopefully we'll have a very fruitful discussion after Olga's and Lynne's presentations. And I just wanted to remind that today we will be talking, we'll be discussing different ways of integrating contemporary Russian cinema into intermediate mid to advanced Russian language courses. So thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to do this all, I'm running the world here from a web screen, just because some of the materials I'm going to show are going to come to you that way. Can everyone hear me all right? Okay. I put learning in the title here, teaching and learning Russian language and culture through film. And as we said, it's been a difficult couple of days. And if I forget anything or lose my way, I'll find my way back there. First, thanks to the graduate students at Brown who have helped with these materials and who have taught earlier versions of our upper level third and fourth year Russian language courses, Irina, Anastasia, and the other Anastasia, Ksenia, and Sofia. So I have a couple of quotes here to look at. Claire Kromsch calling for greater reflexivity and interpretive capacities on the part of learners and teachers, and the increased complexity in the way we are to conceive of language, communication, and culture and learning. It is important that students learn how to use language to bridge the gaps between C1 and C2, native culture and target culture. I would argue that that even may simplify things a little too much, because our students may come from a variety of C1s, but they are all in a particular place when we do the classroom work. Culture is viewed as a world view to be discovered in the language, discovered in the language itself, and in the interaction of interlocutors that use that language. So that all suggests that getting our students who are intermediate mids, maybe intermediate high, in some cases advanced, and I'll be talking about the lower end of that, students in a third year, sixth semester class who are probably doing many things still at the intermediate mid-level, but also might easily be reading at the intermediate high level, are probably talking at a variety of levels, because there are non-heritage speakers and heritage speakers in the group mixed. The ones who these days, none of them really have been abroad because reasons. And so we're looking at that kind of auditoria. I'm going to try to take about 20 minutes to do the following things. To think about what the culture is that we are putting into this work, considering that we are working on films, and how to choose what of the vast array of cultural moments that are in a film we're going to focus on, how to choose the areas of emphasis in language that we're going to focus on, and where do these intersect. And I'm going to suggest that these constitute learning opportunities for us that one teacher may choose one set of and another teacher may choose another set of. But we do have to think ourselves critically about them and which ones we want to focus on. We have to consider our language-driven work versus content-driven work, and the fact that we are taking students who are perhaps still intermediates, but we're working them towards the actual advanced standards in terms of what we're asking them to do. We're building their ability to narrate, we're building their ability to describe. We are also doing that while focusing on a text. And I'll talk a little bit about the film as a text and other texts we may use as well. We have to set content and culture learning goals, and we have to think about what our comprehension and production goals are, because those can be very different. And we also have to think finally in terms of working to have students look at the at the cultural products they are consuming, interpreting, trying to understand what we see as interpretive or bridging goals for them. Sorry, I'm pressing the wrong button. So ACTFL makes, I think, the complexity of this clear in this statement. Learners move along the proficiency continuum at different speeds in each of these. They bring prior skills and experience, but text complexity or length, and above all, familiarity with topic and background knowledge can make huge differences in a student's ability to interpret a visual text. That's aside from things that we associate with interpreting written texts, like using different literacy strategies, understanding point of view, noting organizational features, etc. This is a 6th semester course. We were using the film My Perestroika. I started using it primarily because I had seen it and liked it, and I thought when I saw it, it might work well in our 3rd year sequence. Robin Hessman is an alum of Brown University. She did a degree at Brown in undergrad and then went off and did another degree at VGIK. So she spent 5 years being a regular student at VGIK, and this was what grew out of her time there. The film is released, I think, 2010, but the actual filming was done leading up to the 2008 election, i.e. the swap of Putin and Medvedev election. And I very quickly, after we started working with it, realized we need to have a lot of other kinds of readings to help build context. So I've added in, I would call them semi-authentic readings. Native speakers help edit those documents. They're based on internet and textbook sources. They are, however, not texts that are written for adult consumers. There is some consideration taken of what their level, the learner's level is. Что такое застой is one of those. Что такое оттепель is another. There are 3 texts they read on перестройка and гласность. Что такое перестройка, вторая половина, or третий этап перестройки, первый, второй этапы перестройки. And those focus students' attention on both the content, what happened, learning to summarize it using text vocabulary, improving accuracy, and relating the content to what is expressed by the interviewees. Now, My Perestroika, for those of you who don't know, is a set of interviews conducted with 5 Russians who all went to 57-я школа in Moscow. And they were all born around 1966, I would say, or 67. So they are coming of age in the late Perestroika years, going off into the army in about 1987 or 6, maybe they're probably born in 1968. They're going in mid Perestroika. Several of the men go off into the army. They come back, and as they say, to a completely different country, because it was 2 years at the time. But we also wanted to have some other readings. So over the years, I've added in a couple of fragments from Время Secondhand, because that's also interview based. And there are 2 interviews in particular. One person who was passionately za perestroiku, and one who was passionately против перестройки, and they give their opinions about it. We use songs that appear in the movie, including Поезд в огне. And we see posters of the late Soviet and Perestroika years, and other images, of course, and the film is chock-a-block full of them. The challenges in terms of culture, the culture is embedded very deeply in the text and visuals, and the text carries the culture, but there's another set of distinctions there. We're carrying the author, the director's vision, and she's not actually Russian, although she's very deeply immersed in the culture. But then also the culturally grounded viewpoints of the 5 interviewees, who are very different from one another on purpose. They are a musician, a sort of ne'er-do-well punk rocker, a sort of a businessman, a 2 history teachers, and one kind of woman who works as some sort of manager dealing with the billiards and pool industry, the games industry. And they're very different living circumstances. They have very different views of what happened. But they have many things in common as well. Also difficult is that students bring their own cultural presuppositions to the game, and we can't always uncover what it is that they think about perestroika. So one of our goals is to try and do that. Language, the culture connects with the specifics of language, requires you to describe certain kinds of events. Pokhoron Brezhneva comes up in the movie. The students may not even know who Brezhnev is, let alone how his funeral occurred and was broadcast on television, and that it was enacted by children playing games. Deficit produktov, Sukhoy Zakon in the 90s, Chelnok. And students need to learn something about these things. Cohesive devices, we do a lot of work on vodные slova, complex sentences using to, что, and correctly using the names of leaders. Because Vladimir Lenin isn't going to cut it. Vladimir Ilyich is what people will say, and they need to know that the patronymic has a role. There's a lot of verbs. Повышаться, повыситься. Цены повышаются. Водить, вести войска, for example. We wind up dealing with the topic of what happens at the turn of the 1980s, and we need to talk about the fact that there was Afghanistan. Okay, next. We want to balance language and content-driven content and assess all of those things. I'm skipping quickly over this because I want to get to examples. And the learner uses the content material to learn information and write about that information. The students, as I said, are at that level with about 380 hours of previous study, and this is their second non-textbook centered course. They are good at talking about themselves. As a result of their previous course, they can do some sustained narration, some description with a lot of errors, but they have little ability to combine detailed historical content with the discussion of an individual's story, motivations, and behavior. That's something that we work on. Okay, I think I'm not going to pause for questions because we have another speaker, unless you guys think that's a good idea.
No, we'll keep the questions after Olga presents her part.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, so here are some examples. And I'm just going to do this. I put this in a Google Doc because that was how it was going to work best. At the beginning, you can see over the course of the semester some activities that we're doing. At the beginning, we actually work on who the leaders are. And of course, the pictures didn't come through in the Google version because I forgot to move them. Imagine that there are pictures of, for example, Chernenko, Brezhnev, right? All of the Soviet leaders are here, starting with Lenin. And Первый советский лидер, and I allied this with 2 topics. One is learning the phrase come to power, be in power, and learning how to say при ком. Because otherwise they always want to say когда был Брежнев? Во время Брежнева. It's like, oh. So we do want to learn how to say при ком. So they had to match all of these names and patronymics at home to the photos that are there in the actual document, the Word doc. And then they had to come up with their dates, and we worked on the dates together in class. And пришел к власти, ушел в отставку, or умер у власти. And then we also learned при, and learned how to say при Сталине, при Брежневе. And then they got a set of events. Первый взрыв атомной бомбы в СССР. And you could do this either as a homework assignment that they have to come in and talk about. You could assign some of them different events. I actually, because this group had some people who had studied the history, we were able to do it just in class, but in some years I assign it as homework. And, they were pretty good at some things and pretty bad at others. Like ottipel, most of them were unsure about. Repressi Большой Terror was not a heavy lift. They got that. Распад СССР, many of them said при Ельцине. They weren't sure. Августовский путч, most of them weren't really sure what that was. And постсоветский экономический кризис, инфляция и безработица. Again, при Горбачеве, it's like, no, постсоветский is really not. So there were a lot of difficulties there. Another major area we worked on was кто или кем, because a lot of these sentences in encyclopedia entries, in Wikipedia, in textbook language, are going to say not первый лидер, приехавшим, первым советским лидером, приехавшим с официальным визитом в США, оказался Никита Сергеевич Хрущев. So they've been seeing this являться кем in the first semester, but here the word order is sometimes backwards from the way we think it is, and I wanted them to think about where is the text and where is the comment on the main point and where is the comment. So they eventually got a little bit more comfortable with that and learned that it's not just являться that uses that instrumental. It's not just stall, and not just when you're talking about someone's profession. Now, are they going to enact that themselves beautifully? Not really yet, but they're much more comfortable with sentences where the subject of the sentence is living way at the end and there is a являться. The next thing we did was they had a set of images, and I think here I do need to show you what the set of images says. Let me just open my actual document so that you can see it in Word, and I will stop the share and just we'll look at it that way, because you'll be happier. I'll be happier. No, not that one. Sorry. I always forget that I can't. Okay. Let me share. Okay. So this is when they watch the trailer of the film. And the trailer is very compact and makes reference visually to all kinds of things that I have to check how much they know about them. We all experienced pionieri in the first semester when we were doing stiliagi, but not all of them know who these people are. They don't know what the Oktyabriata are, and they sort of remember Komsomolцы, and they don't, but these are the things that occur in that trailer. So I gave them some language to help them kind of figure out what perestroika is, что такое железный занавес, почему в фильме показывают советское детство, and there's some language here to help them answer those questions. And then there's some vocabulary work for them to do. So it's a small activity, but it's just a way of getting them started. I'll go back to my other document now. Okay. And then that's one type of activity. They also have we try to unpack this idea of счастливое детство. We're not dealing with the Stalinist period, but they do get a little talk from me on where that term comes from. They learn how to use the word поколение. Счастливое детство is one of the things that comes up in the movie a lot, because it turns out that all of these 5 people talk about how happy their childhoods were. And that's somewhat unexpected for the students who are thinking that, I grew up in the USSR, that must have sucked. And in fact, the childhoods that they experienced were kind of happy. And then we go on to the film itself, which I have divided up into about 12 excerpts. And very quickly on, because the film's interviewees speak very quickly, I realized that I did need to have us working sometimes with actual text. So thank you to the TA, Irina Nitsko, who transcribed this for me. But we work sometimes with excerpts of the actual text because it lets us explore certain kinds of language, certain kinds of cohesive devices, when things are very conversational, what kinds of terminology are being used. And it also enables the students to get a model for some of the things that I want them to learn how to say. Like I imagined myself as, one of them says, I was never a creative sort of person. Я никогда не был творческим человеком. Well, that to me seemed like very good language for my students to have. And then here they have to identify which of the speakers in this excerpt this describes, which is another way of turning, I could spell никогда right too, which is another way of turning the text's language more into their language that they can talk about. Because this movie has a plot only in the sense that there's a historical set of time periods that we pass through and we learn the characters' stories. But there is not a conventional movie plot. And тексты к речи, they do this kind of activities that I've done elsewhere where you match beginnings to ends of sentences so that you wind up, and this is pitched more at the student's level of language. You найдите в тексте следующие выражения so that they learn how to express some of the key ideas. And then eventually they're ready to put together плюсы и минусы советского детства по мнениям героев. And that's just on one excerpt. They're going to do this with all 12 of them. And then they can finally prepare вопросы к дискуссии. And after that, they work on to the next ones. Interspersed in there are bits of reading. Оттепель was the first one we did. Застой we're going to be doing next week. And we finally get to Perestroika about 2/3 of the way through the semester as the film is getting to that point. And here is where they finally do see, we finally do get to the actual Perestroika text. This text is about похороны Брежнева. So there's an image in the movie of young kids playing at похороны Брежнева. They've turned a baby carriage or something into a casket and they're carrying it along in the snow. And I found an Огонек article called «Как я хранил Брежнева» from about 2004. And I thought, well, that will work well. And so they got asked to look up, this is in an online reading assignment we did last year when we were online all the time. They had to find out a little bit about what Огонек was. They had to come up with how they thought this should be translated and interpreted. They had already seen the relevant clip from the movie, but it goes by pretty quickly while the Aquarium song is playing, Поезд в огне, and there's a lot to focus on there. So, какой союз закончился не в 91-м, а в 82-м? The answer is the союз детства этого автора and смерть Брежнева, but they work their way up to being able to figure that out. And here is the text itself, which I glossed some of, and asked them to do certain kinds of dictionary work on. I didn't use the entire text. I used about 2/3 of it, half to 2/3 of it. And they're able to read this. В ноябре 82 года мне было 9 лет. Places where I knew they were going to have a lot of trouble, I did give them some glossing. And then at the end of that, they have some слова, которые я смотрел в словаре, перевод на английский, словарные формы этих слов. This is because one of the things we work on in third year is independent reading. And I watch their dictionary strategies and try to see how they're doing the looking up that they're doing. So if they look up a word like руководитель, I'm expecting them to write руководитель, translate it, put the phrase from the text руководитель, как должен был быть руководитель, and then also maybe to come up with the словарная форма if it's not in that, but also to say maybe there's a verb, руководить, чем, because I want them to start to do that work on their own. They write down key ideas in English. They write down keywords and phrases in Russian that are expressing those ideas. And then they read the rest of the text on their own after we talk about it in class. So it's a two-part activity. The next activity I'm going to show, I've got just two more. This is the Perestroika text. Again, it has pre-reading, doing some dictionary work to work out things like there's a difference between campania and campagna, and they're not necessarily going to figure that out easily. Words like cooperative don't mean cooperate. It means something else. Ускорение, some of the keywords, I want them to identify ahead of time. And then also a set of word formation things, matching nouns to verbs. And then they actually read the text. And this one was set up as a GDoc, so the image is there. They have some images in here, курс на ускорение, for example, related to сухой закон. And then they have questions to answer. They have some начало и конец предложения. And then they have второй этап перестройки. And over the course of about 3 days of class, we work our way through this while also focusing on some of the scenes in the movie. And they have some comprehension activities after every text. That's третий этап перестройки, of course, and гласность. And then the last thing I'm going to show you is the Alexievich reading, which again required students to understand what are talonly, what do they look like? Because the two people interviewed talk about these things. What is a челнок? Which is another thing. One of them is doing челночная работа. And I tried to think of, what is the ultimate symbol of a челнок? It's that. And here are some of the images that they have to identify, and they get that in Russian. So giving them the input to actually say these things in Russian is very important. But I also wanted to make sure that they understood what those things were. So I required them to do it both in Russian and in English here. Then we did a little bit of an activity with talonly just to see what they thought might be something you would have to get по талонам. And most of them didn't guess, for example, some of the things that were по талонам, right? And then finally, I wanted to get that cultural comparison. What is it that they learned about perestroika in school, which in most cases these days is not very much. They learned the word Gorbachev and not much else. And they had a checklist. These were things I learned in school. And it was, a lot of them said, Ronald Reagan выиграл холодную войну, which is not specifically something we learned about perestroika. But that was a very common yes answer. And then they read two excerpts from Время second-hand. The students last year read different ones. They were each assigned to read one. And this one was «Мы поверили Горбачеву, сейчас уже никому так легко не поверим». And then text B is Gorbachev предал коммунизм, which, tells you where this one is going to go. And then they write down what положительно и отрицательно was about these two periods. They get together in class and they share what it is that they've been finding out. Because they're writing down phrases from this and because they're encouraged to use other kinds of vocabulary. For example, we learn early on phrases like verbs like повышаться, повыситься, уменьшаться, уменьшиться, увеличиваться, увеличиться. If you're going to talk about anything connected with inflation, дефициты продуктов, etc., you need those kinds of words. You need words like исчезать, исчезнуть, пропадать, пропасть. And trying to think of, in this case, the language they need to talk about the film that's not in the film is often language related to history. We also, I'm going to finish now because I know my time is probably up, but we also spend a fair amount of time investigating the students' own school experience and growing up experience as in terms of how they think values were inculcated for them. Как это вы поняли, что такое хороший человек? Когда вы были в 5 классе? One scene in the movie has Soviet school children writing a сочинение. And it's when I grow up, I want to be like. Я хочу быть похожей на бабушку. Бабушка хорошая коммунист, right? So there's this set of particular kinds of stampa you would see in a Soviet essay of that period, but also it pushes the students to think a little bit about, well, were there certain kinds of things what is a good American, right? When you are 10 years old in a school. What kinds of things do American school children get taught to value highly? And I'm going to stop there and yield the floor up to Olga, but I'm happy to answer any questions. At the end of this semester, students do an oral presentation on a phenomenon connected to the late Soviet period, like the Armenian earthquake of 1988, like there's always one who wants to do Chernobyl, people that we didn't explore in any kind of depth. Sometimes they're musicians, other kinds of things that occurred in that period. And they wind up knowing quite a lot about the last 10 years of the Soviet experience, or 15 or 20 maybe. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynne. Now, Lynne, if you can stop sharing your presentation so Olga can
sorry.
share. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Thank you.
This out. Let's see. Okay, there we go. Can you guys see what I'm doing? Can everybody see? Yeah, excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Lynne. That was fascinating. Thank you, ACTR, for organizing this, and thank you, everybody, for being here. It's an honor. Such a fantastic group, and so many familiar faces and so many new faces. So I'll just give a little bit of my background, because I think that really explains how I came to teaching cinema. I'm an associate professor of Russian, but I teach really in 2 programs. I teach Russian, and I direct the Russian Studies program since 2004. I've been doing that, but I also teach in the World Film Studies program, where I teach courses in English on Russian cinema and on global sort of introduction to global film. So this mix of Russian language and world film courses that I've been doing, for over 2 decades now, really kind of led me to this interest of how to incorporate in meaningful ways full-length feature films into a class and into various levels of a language curriculum, to a Russian language curriculum specifically. And so in my presentation today, I will try to give you just some snippets and some practical considerations of film-based curriculum that I developed based on 2 of my textbooks, Kino Talk that came out with Slavika in 2007. And that book, as you can probably see from the table of contents, covered films of the 90s, really. So starting with Heart of the Dog by Vladimir Bartko, which came out in 1987, and wrapping it up with 2 films from 98. Brat Balabanov, Brother, right, and then Land of the Deaf by Valery Todorovsky. So these are really films from the 90s. And then my most recent book from a year and a half ago, from 2020, that really focuses on very contemporary cinema, including the film that Lynne just talked about, My Perestroika. Now, of course, because this textbook covers 12 films, it does not go into the kind of depth that Lynne covers throughout the whole semester, right? That's what she do in her class. So this is not as much in depth, but by the same token, this covers 12 films and sort of gives a somewhat different perspective, I think, on all of these films. Okay, so I usually teach both books in a mixed class of advanced learners and heritage speakers. These materials, especially during the pandemic, have come in very handy to be taught asynchronously via Canvas. That actually has been a very useful textbook there. I've taught this course format-wise as a full semester course, as a half semester course. Our semesters are 15 weeks, so half semester would be 8 weeks. And then I've also taught it as a very intensive 6 weeks course, multiple hours a day, okay? Before I go into the curriculum and the textbook itself, let me go I'll go back for a second. Let me go on a brief лирическое отступление and just kind of give you a little bit of a theoretical background that has informed my work and sort of my interest in all of this. Now, of course, the place of cinema and the role of all sorts of audiovisual forms have been on the radar of many language and pedagogy scholars since 1980s. Kramsh, of course, that Lynne quoted, one of those scholars, right? What I have really gotten fascinated with is the work that's been done by British Film Institute, or the BFI, who began working really in the 1990s on a project that covered a range of curricula in K through 16, so not just K through 12. So K, including the really early levels of secondary schools, all the way to college. And basically, they were trying to incorporate films into all of these various curricula, including curricula on languages, which they called screening languages. Okay, this was a fairly short project, probably the shortest of them all, unfortunately. It ran between 2013 and 2015. It included 27 teachers from 19 schools in Britain and involved close to 800 pupils. Now, what they did was they used short authentic films in a range of languages. Unfortunately, Russian was not one of those languages either. They used German, Spanish, Turkish, Arabic, Italian, Mandarin, Chinese, and French, so no Russian. But the idea was to basically see how using these short films in a class impacts language learning and teaching, okay? And so from a perspective of a language educator, what I find absolutely fascinating, that BFI, first of all, defines film not just simply as a text, but as a shared and vital global language, right? So now if film is a language, it would appear that perhaps teaching film and teaching language should share some essential elements, right? So if film is a language, then how do you teach film competency, right? If there's language competency, can there be film competency? Or maybe the ability to critically watch a film, to analyze the context, content, to analyze cinematography, technical aspects, et cetera, et cetera. Well, interestingly enough, in parallel to the 5 C's, that we are all so well familiar with, or perhaps supplementing these 5 C's, BFI came up with their own C's, except their C's are 3 C's. And so the framework for film education includes 3 components that in reality correspond very nicely to what world readiness standards stand for, right? They use the critical, cultural, and creative components. Now, the critical dimension, and I'll quote, is developing a culture of informed, reflective film viewing that enables learners to recognize how films present arguments and viewpoints on the world. Now, this, of course, really corresponds to several of the standards in the world readiness standards, right, that deal with acquiring information from diverse perspectives, using language to reflect on culture, et cetera, et cetera. So if you think of critical, it really mixes very well with connections, comparisons, and communities. Sort of moving forward to creative, that really focuses on, well, genuinely student creatively doing their work, writing a film script, doing a storyboard, or actually simply making a film. That really ties into communicating through, now not a language of an actual linguistic language, right, but through the means of a medium, through film, okay? And of course, what really ties together completely directly between the BFI standards and world readiness standards is this concept of cultures. This is what BFI says. Whoops, let's see. No. There, film can help us understand ourselves and our cultural and national identities, as well as our history. But film can also help us understand other people, other cultures, times, ideas, and values. The wider our access to film, the deeper and broader will be our engagement with the world. Okay, so this very kind of apt connection between all of these C's is quite striking, right? Between the C's of film learning and language learning. And I think a very apt sort of summary of this comes from a colleague of ours, Rima Garn from the University of Utah, who wrote an article in 2012 about what she called the cinema's powerful potential to teach the 5 C's, quote, in an efficient and memorable way. Now, she actually suggested that there should be no just 5 C's. There should be more than 5 C's. There should be definitely a C number 6. And her C number 6, well, perhaps not surprising, is actually cinema, right? Which I think is a very witty observation and actually very apt. And so Garn justifies that decision by saying, quote, if we want the situation with foreign language study in this country to change, if we want to contribute to the national effort to promote the 5 C's, yet another C for cinema offers us a highly effective means to this end. Again, cinema definitely blends in really nicely with the language, I think, as we probably all know, right? But so I'll switch now back to my KinoTalk curriculum. And as I was working with that curriculum, I was really hoping to combine all of these multiple C's into one holistic approach that blends language pedagogy with elements of film analysis, even if that film analysis is on a fairly basic level. So let's get back to KinoTalk itself. Now, even though the book includes my most recent book, it involves or includes 12 films, I usually teach about 9 or 10 per semester, okay? How did I select the films for my most recent book? Well, I wanted to stay contemporary in the 21st century. I was definitely aiming for variety, stylistic and generic, right? So kind of aiming for a range of genres. Of course, historical, cultural richness of all these contexts, as well as accessibility of cinematic language and just simply general appeal to the students, okay? And as you can see from films from the table of contents on your screen, and I'll also move through some of it, I bring together quite a cross-section of films, right? Allowing students to sample such art house films as Alexander Sakharov's «Русский ковчег», Андрей Звягинцев «Возвращение», Андрей Хржановский, film about Иосиф Бродский, «Room and a Half», «Полторы комнаты», да, или «Сентиментальное путешествие на родину». Стиляги, that I know Lynne teaches in over a semester in one of her classes, Андрей Кравчук «Итальянец». Now we're starting to move into more poignant sort of dramas, sort of the socio-political statements, right? Yuri Bykov's «Дурак», Geographer Drank His Globe Away, and a very popular film with the students' modern day sort of fairy tale take on The Mermaid, well, Mermaid, okay? So the question I often also get practically when I show these films and I say that, yes, I teach 9 or 10 of these films in one class, the question is, how do you do? Do you break it up? Do you break the films up? Do you show them in segments, or do you show it in one sitting? Is it assigned as a homework? What I usually do is teach it in one class. We are very fortunate, I guess, at Iowa State. We can select our own schedules in a way. So if I say that my class will run from 6 to 9 on a Monday night, that's precisely what I can do. So I get this very kind of luxurious schedule where I can do 25 to 30 minutes of previewing activities. Then I can screen the whole 90-minute film, sometimes even longer than 90 minutes. And then I still have another about an hour, right, left for post-viewing activities, abundant discussion, and students can still get a lot of homework to come into the next Monday prepared for the next film and to be ready to discuss that, okay? Generally speaking, from my perspective, from my experience, this kind of format works really well. Students like this kind of cinematic or movie theater going kind of experience, right? That usually contributes to their sort of very positive perception of the class. They also really, kind of big thing that I like, that they see the entire narrative structure of the film. They can really get the character development. They really perceive that film as an art form. It's not this little snippet, right? It's not a little segment that I always fear they'll start perceiving as not an actual art form, as not a film. It'll become a sort of an educational tool, right? Something that we use along with the textbook. So that visual richness is remaining, and I think this is wonderful. Of course, an alternative, I understand that not everybody has the kind of luxury that I have, right? Would be to watch the film at home, preview it at home, however that fits into the schedule, and then use the class time more strategically for previewing and post-viewing activities, okay? And then, of course, there's also a way to break the film into multiple sequences or 2 segments or whatever works, again, with the format of the class, right? There are some studies that shorter sequences are less cognitively challenging for students, that they get less tired. Although, again, I think that such format might diminish some richness. So if at any point you could maybe show them that entire film, I think that might be very good. But again, whatever really works, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here. I do also, whenever I talk about teaching film, get a question, do you use film terminology? And anytime I start talking about BFI, right, do you introduce all these terms on film angles and cuts and camera distances and things of that nature. And again, I'll go to BFI research that they've actually dealing with high school teachers. Notice the teachers avoid teaching film oftentimes because they're intimidated by the fact that analyzing film in a classroom is going to entail having to deal with the jargon. And so there's a fear of just the jargon, right? So as I'm putting together these textbooks, I'm definitely trying to stay very cognizant of that and sort of aiming for a sort of terminology light, so to speak, right? Without really overwhelming the textbook and the narrative with abundant terminology, yet staying with terminology that is ultimately in the vocabulary probably of any educated native speaker, and that certainly can be in the vocabulary of an advanced or upper intermediate student. And I'll give you an example here. So this is an introductory chapter from my book. And you can see that it introduces some very film-specific terminology, like in the section Other. We have короткометражный фильм, полнометражный film, which I always find out that students actually don't know in English what короткометражный or short film is, right? You have to explain it to them. But there are also things like, for example, режиссер, scenarist, right? I mean, those are just basic professions that really are sort of like the light version, right? Or just basic things that pertain to narratives, right? I mean, film is ultimately telling a story, right? That's sort of the key point of it. So сюжет, right? Приключения, things of that nature. I'll show you also an activity from the introductory chapter. Again, terminology light, big time. There are things like, again, художник по костюмам, сценарист, художник-постановщик, also визуальный образ персонажа фильма, right? So there are some very basic things that I think students are actually very likely to incorporate and use. These seem, a lot of these are cognates too, right? But these get incorporated into their own production quite easily. And what I also like to do throughout the book and in all of my classes, sort of try to put all of these questions in context that pertain to them, that are relevant to the students, right? Where they can speak, well, maybe in more than one sentence, right? Какая из этих профессий вам кажется наиболее интересной, наиболее трудной, etc., etc. Вы бы хотели работать в кино, depending on the level, depending on the group. I mean, this actually goes into all sorts of interesting discussions and directions, okay? So there. Let's talk about sequencing of activities. Well, it's a film class, right? So basically, whether you are teaching a full-length feature film or you are teaching excerpts or segments, right? You basically still follow the traditional sequencing, right? That has worked for many, many years, right? Of previewing and post-viewing activities. I usually assign most previewing activities that also include vocabulary lists. And this list is from The Mermaid as home assignments, okay? And so students usually work on the vocab lists that are then incorporated or reworked and practiced through a variety of activities. So there's a lot of semantic material for them to incorporate, right? So giving them a lot of time and plenty of activities. These are just little segments of what kind of word building or analyzing, right? Sort of structures of the word, etc. I usually don't explain grammatical points within the film. Now, this is from a chapter on Russian arc, okay? But this is not to say that I do not ever use grammar, especially if the objective of that specific class is to work on some language-driven stuff, right? So, for example, verbs with prefixes and aspects, right? And of course, all of these sentences that students are dealing with, like here they would be using vocabulary that was introduced in those lists, right, in those lists of words initially at the beginning of the chapter or at the beginning of the class, within this specific context of the film. I think that's been one of the challenges in actually writing all of this, to put that particular grammar specifically in this film-related context. Now, what has been helpful, a lot of these things, and I know it's also very helpful for students, a lot of these things actually I've taken directly out of the film. So some of these sentences I actually taken directly from the film, maybe slightly paraphrased. So this is previewing, right? So as the students actually watch that, and they already struggled with the sentence many a time at home in class, so they already said it multiple times. By the time they hear it, they recognize it, right? So this is kind of a fun thing if you can remove subtitles, and I usually screen films with subtitles, but if you can remove a part of a subtitle, some of these sentences that they already dealt with, you can remove the translation and see if they recognize it. That's kind of a neat little trick to play with, okay? But so here you have verbs, and next задание 4 deals with nouns and adjectives in a variety of case forms. Okay, so I'll move along. So another part of previewing activities would also be to incorporate some readings. And just like Lynne just showed you a bunch of readings that she uses, I also like to use fairly, not terribly short, between maybe 300 and 1,000 words, definitely under 1,000 words, texts that I, at least in the book, predominantly wrote myself. I didn't want me to be the only authentic voice, so I really tried to incorporate as many bits and pieces from various film critics. I like Anton Dolin's writing, if you're familiar with that critic's very exquisite text that he produces, and very easy, very accessible, and funny at times. So students relate very well to him. So I use a lot of his texts, and so I sort of blended it all together. And then basically students are guided through these various readings about the film, about the director, and then followed up by comprehension checks on those readings. Again, most of this is assigned as homework, and then we usually spend about half an hour in class working usually on the questions. Don't usually reread things in class. And there's lots of sort of practice things like задание 7. How are these specific numbers basically linked to what you just read? 90 minutes, what is it? Well, it's an uncut film of 90 minutes, right? Russian arc. So 1,5 kilometer, well, that's how long the camera guy walked, right? Etc., etc. So I'll zoom in a little bit on this задание 8, because I think it gives me a good possibility to, first of all, immediately have students think about cinema and vocabulary related to cinema. Киноман. Кто это? Кто такой киноман? Вы киноман? Как вы это понимаете? Да, etc. Something that, you know, oftentimes they don't quite know how to answer, but kind of causes all sorts of interesting discussions usually. And then I like these type assignments, have a mini research on the internet, this one specifically. If you recall the Russian art, there's that one spot where we go into this black and white sequence, right, of Leningrad under the blockade, and there are coffins in the Hermitage, right? It's a very, very powerful moment, right? But so just so that the students understand what they're about to see and why are there coffins in the Hermitage and what is going on there exactly. This is always a very popular activity. They like doing internet research. It's easy for them. Wikipedia in Russian, they discover very quickly, right? And it gives them all sorts of different information, right? But you can also, of course, direct them to sites. That would be another activity. But so this is very, very popular. And then here too, if you look at, for example, номер 4, question number 4 there, this is where I'm linking it to what I was just saying about BFI, right? Steadicam, что это такое? And they just read about it, right? That one of those articles explained to them how the film was made, what Steadicam is, how he carried it, etc., etc. So they should be able to, in a very simple way, explain it based on what they just read. And they, of course, can consult the text that they just read, okay? Okay, so we're moving into post-viewing. Post-viewing, probably the first thing to do would be to basically check comprehension. I usually go two directions. Did you like the movie? Вам понравился фильм? Что вам понравилось? Question in a lot of contexts, just kind of to liven things up. Which American actor could play this particular character? That usually leads to lots of laughter and lots of just kind of fun activity, that good group activity, right? Who could play well in Globus propил Slushkin, right? Who could be, well, any of those characters really, right? These type basic comprehension check, I like to actually do as just this rapid fire question. Don't really let them go into groups, but just like really pointing to people very quickly, right? Is he married? Does he have children? You know, I try to get, this is usually just basically a sentence, right? Very, very brief responses. To then you move on to slightly different activities that are still engaging material from the film. This I do with every chapter. Кому принадлежат эти реплики и когда, в какой момент фильма они прозвучали. They might not remember when they heard it. They might not remember who said this. This could be done as a group activity. The majority of lines I pulled are pretty clear. They should know. They probably will remember. I'm sure they will recognize that they were paying attention, but this is a good comprehension check, okay? And then moving on to slightly more creative activities. Кому из героев фильма лучше всего подходят следующие характеристики? And these are all words from the vocabulary lists again, right? Like бесстрашный, карьерист, неудачник. They were supposed to study those, right? So we're continuing to kind of practice and scaffold all of that material, okay? Back to that same describing characters, I'm taking it to a slightly more complex level, going into Dolin that I already mentioned. Now he's taking it out of that vocabulary list that students are familiar with, right? Taking it to a slightly less recognizable format. This might be a good homework assignment as well. But so again, read through these characteristics that Dolin gives that protagonist and agree or disagree with him. Is he пьющий неудачник средних лет? Живет с нелюбящей его женой. Его жена любит или нет? Почему? Откуда вы знаете? Зарплата у него скромнейшая. And that, of course, can go, why is a high school teacher making such little money? Is that normal? Et cetera, right? So this can really go into a range of, again, discussions depending on the level of the class and depending on what the objectives of the course is. I mean, ultimately, it's all driven by objectives, right? A good activity for the post-viewing is to take activities from the film and put them in chronological order, right? If it's a more advanced class, students can specifically talk about one of these. This could also actually be a written activity, right? Talk about that specific детство в Испании. This is from Legend 17. I don't know if you guys are recognizing this. What was he doing in Spain? He was, was he little, et cetera, right? So there's all sorts of things to discuss there. I always incorporate some critical text. This is very lightly adapted. I feel like this is very important, just so, again, they get authentic language. And here I try to incorporate different film critics, again, tying back to the BFI, right, objectives, that we're talking about film as it is an art form, right? There's a specialist in writing about film, a film critic in Russia, right? And this is what they're talking about. Again, this, as you can see, is from Legend 17. And then again, there are follow-up questions and sort of invitation to more open paragraph length conversation. Freeze frame. This is a very good activity that BFI actually recommends on any level of the curriculum, and in any, even if you are teaching arithmetic with film, this is one of the kind of strategies that they use. Of course, I'm not using a freeze frame here, but the instructor can simply stop a film, right, have a freeze frame on the screen and have students describe it that way. Very flexible, because then you can pick whatever freeze frame you want, right? You can, I have these photos, basically stills, right, from the film, and you can have the students follow the questions that I have. There's all sorts of other possibilities, of course, depending on the level of the film. What is happening, right? Мальчик сидит, почему он там сидит, его брат и папа уехали, да, etc. So the level, of course, can be just entirely different, but this is really starting to ask students to produce, to create their own speech, right? To really describe something related to the film on a simple or as advanced a level as they can. And I'm trying usually to prompt them with questions. This could also be a very good written activity for homework. Okay. And then lastly, the post-viewing activities, I also like to take really outside of the film. Okay, I'm back to geographer during the global way. And so I often incorporate results of various polls from ВЦИОМ or Levada Center based on the topic related to the film. Well, this one discusses the prestige of the professor or high school teacher's job, and would Russians like their children to become school teachers, okay? And then I'm tying this into their own questions. And of course, the film they just watched dealt only with school life, right? And this miserable teacher who ultimately became very popular with the students, really only after he left that school, right? After he got fired basically from school, he became even more popular, and he seems really happy too. We'll leave it at that. But, so these kind of questions of, is this a popular profession in your country or where you live, right? What are the prestigious professions in your country? So again, really taking it out of the film into contexts that students can relate to and understand. Okay. Lastly, and this is for sort of taking it out into sort of broader research, internet research, perhaps. This I usually allow students to just pick one assignment that they like throughout the entire semester. And at the end of the semester, we dedicate a whole 3-hour-long class to their presentations. Well, like this one, for example, they are comparing Tarkovsky and Звягинцев. And why is it that Звягинцев is called Второй Tarkovsky, да, или современный Tarkovsky? Compare these films, watch a film by Tarkovsky. There's always somebody who is fascinated by Stalker or Solaris and really wants to watch those films and sort of make a presentation on that. So I think I'll stop right here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions as well. I'm trying to stop sharing there.
Thank you so much, Olga, for a wonderful presentation. And I just wanted also to tell everyone that today we have invited several more colleagues of ours, specifically Alisa de Blasio, Isa Savinkova, and I think we have Irina Walsh today. And these are the 3 colleagues of ours who are currently working and finishing their work on new textbooks in which they incorporate media and film in the language classroom. So hopefully they will be able also to participate in our discussion and maybe share something about their experience creating materials for language classes using media and film. So otherwise, we will probably open the floor for any questions. Zhanna Budinkova, please.
Hello, thank you so much to both speakers for your wonderful presentations. There are a lot of very inspiring, inspirational ideas. I have a question to Olga, pretty technical one, actually. So I'm just wondering, like you mentioned that your students do presentations at the end of this class, yes, that they're taking about films. So could you elaborate a little more what kind of presentation is it? I'll use it probably as an idea for inspiration, my personal inspiration. Thank you so much.
Do you mean the actual format or the topics of the presentation?
Yeah, just both essentially, like a couple of words maybe.
Well, like with this particular one that I was just talking about, right, comparing Zvyagintsev and Tarkovsky, usually students just get fascinated with Tarkovsky and start talking about him forever. I had a couple students take it to a very technical level and actually film something. I had two students do a conversation between Tarkovsky and Zvyagintsev. And that was great. It so happens that my Language Studies Resource Center has a green screen. So they were kind of sitting against that and they were enacting a conversation between the two. It was not very historical and it was not very accurate, but they had a blast with it. So those kind of things. I mean, I really, towards the very end of the semester, kind of tried to leave it to their inspiration and their, just for them to have fun, really, right? But that I think would be a good example of what they did.
Okay, thanks so much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. We have Irina and then Daria.
A question for a specific question for Lynne, but a general question for everyone. So one of the characters in my Perestroika was involved in, it became known that there were some problems. And so how do you address that controversy? Do the students know about this? Do you even bring it up? And then the general question for everyone is, it's a question that actually Evgeny posed to the members of the panel on film at the conference. How do we approach films that are controversial when we, or that are triggering? How do we deal with showing these films and discussing these films in class?
Yeah, it's an interesting and not easy to answer question. The issue involving that particular character, who is one of the history teachers, came up when we had started using the film, and I want to acknowledge here Irina Kaplun, did I get it right, Irina? Who was actually the first person who actually taught the course using the film, and I want to acknowledge her here. Hi. Who started, the process of creating activities and transcribing, and worked with the film in its first iteration. So not the films, ours. But it's a question that arose after the film had already been in use at Brown for a couple of years. And I also knew a young woman who had gone to 57 Shkola, and she was not the recipient of those kind of attentions from the teacher, but she knew about it. It was common knowledge among the students in the school. And there was one year when I think we might have talked about it. Irina can also comment on this, but I think at some point I decided, well, I have 13 and a half weeks. It's important, but I try to structure what we're doing in such a way that I don't want our students necessarily to get completely emotionally involved with these characters, because I think doing that would not be right given what the nature of the situation was. It was seksualное домогательство. So we try to look at the characters less as, the way you would identify with, a phrase that Nabokov hated, identify with the characters in a film, and more about thinking about them in terms of people of their time, people who experienced a set of things. And as such, not necessarily, they have their individual features, but that allowed me to feel okay maybe about not dealing with that. Irina, did you by any chance ever bring that up?
I had to a few times when in one of the final essays, some students would write to me something like, if I were in this situation, I would be exactly like this person. I respect him so much. He has such a wonderful critical approach. Then I would have to have this talk. But normally I completely agree. We did exactly the same with you. So we discussed that it's only this amount of weeks and so much work we have to do that we just put it aside.
Yeah, but I don't have an answer to Evgeny's question from the conference, which is really difficult, but I don't know that I would necessarily shy away from anything. There's an enormous trigger moment right at the beginning, not directly, but at the beginning of my Perestroika. One of the first songs you hear is Chungichanga, and a couple students are always, they're out there investigating. They look up the song, they find the cartoon. They are not expecting to see that cartoon. And, we actually did have to have a moment in class where we talked about that in English. The fact that, there was this objectification of young children, cartoon Afrikaanse, right, as being sort of enlightened by the Soviet thinking. It was, but they related to it okay. They said, it's just like the Jungle Book in 1960s America. It's got those same elements of built-in kind of racism, and they were far less worried about it than I thought they were going to be. They took it, they were concerned, but they took it in their stride, and they started to think about it critically.
Okay, we have Daria. Please unmute yourself.
Oh, I would just comment on that. That, we could just get rid of Doktorai Balit as well. I mean, how can you get rid of Doktorai Balit? I'm just saying, if you look at that, if you think deeply into many Soviet works and works of, other cultures, you'll find a lot of these very shameful and terrible interpretations of race and gender relations and this sort of thing. But I think if we explain to the students that, certain countries have certain interpretations and they have certain, there's in their society, these things continue, they're different from our country. I think it is a very good teaching moment. But I understand. I didn't get Chunga Changa until I grew up and became an adult and realized, and then you start analyzing it. It's all very good exercises. I don't think we should be canceling a lot of these great cartoons, especially Cheburashka, because I've also heard about Cheburashka, various interpretations of Cheburashka, and at some point you have to say, I don't know how relevant that is anymore, but I agree. I mean, I always come across these issues and I wonder, how am I going to deal with this in our kind of audience? But my main question is actually very, very practical. And that question is, first of all, I love what both of you do. I love those films. I would love to have a group of students that I could teach those films to in Russian, but we only go up to third year and we have 2 days a week, 2 hours and 15 minutes. So my question is, how do you get them to watch these films? How do you find time to, first of all, what do you give them? Do you have a reserved books room? Do they have to buy these films themselves? What do you do? And for example, I mean, Oblomov is off. You can't find Oblomov anymore with subtitles. If you need to have subtitles, I assume that you don't use subtitles, right? If you don't use subtitles.
No. I mean, I think a third-year student would be mightily challenged to watch my Perestroika without subtitles and understand one word of what was going on.
Right, but you all use subtitles, so maybe my question is
Yeah.
Okay, you use subtitles.
Absolutely, yeah. Have you checked Oblomov? Have you looked for Oblomov on Soviet movies online?
I think it's there.
You mean on Mosti?
I would look there. For some reason, I think
I don't know. Mine
Yeah.
was, I had it and then it was taken off. So now, it says video doesn't work. I'll look under Mosfilm. It makes sense that it should be there.
Mosfilm
But
has
in
most of
general,
Mosfilm has most of their stuff on YouTube, just
I
simple as
think
that.
you're right.
I like Soviet movies online because their subtitles don't come built in. They basically come in as a separate textual file that you can download, and then you can
Right.
basically open it in Word, and you can mess with them however you need. Like I was saying, you can remove certain subtitle from a spot, right? Or you can change it, because sometimes you want to try something different. So I would look there. I can quickly look it up right now. But
Okay, I should do that. It takes a long time and I'm not so good with it. But my question is, how do you deal with their watching these films? Do they have a reserve bookshelf? Do you have everything digitized?
We can digitize the films if they're in the university library. They can be digitized and put onto the library reserves that live on the Canvas website for the course. So the students go to the media player for the course, and then they can watch whatever excerpt or part of the film or other media that I put up there. So it's fairly easy for us, and it lives in this enclosed world of the course, unless it's a film or something that happens to be living on YouTube, and then we will send them to YouTube to watch it.
Right.
Okay.
Canopy is another good platform. Canopy, I'm sure everybody's familiar with that, right?
Canopy has something.
And our library subscribes to that. In fact, I think we're subscribed to unlimited use. So like The Return is on Canopy, Stiляги is on Canopy, and that the nice thing there, the quality is really good. I mean, they really have digitized things to like super perfection, super HD. So you can really project it on a very large screen. So you can really have this movie theater experience if that's what you want.
So this is the institution that subscribes to.
That's, the institutional subscription. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Now, Irina, I can see Irina Dogova, you have your hand up.
Several of you mentioned Stiляги, and now I'm very interested how you deal with illicit sexual sin. Kama Sutra, basically for 3 minutes, maybe not 3. I used to it's my very fresh experience. With Zoom and COVID, they watched it at home and probably discussed before, they could come to Zoom class before me. And probably they discussed it, but I didn't remember this topic. I just didn't remember that it was so long. And this year, we finally resumed the same kind of let's get together and have our movie night. It was 2 weeks ago, guys. You cannot imagine. So 3 girls just left the room, and I was just, why? I don't remember it. Then, of course, I tried to deal with it. So I kind of changed the syllabus. We added Telemost. We added Posner Donahue, I don't remember his name, when секса у нас нет, and we категорически против секса, but it's basically disrupted my whole week off, because they just told me, usually we don't use English in class, but they just told me, we were scandalized. Have you seen this movie before? I said, yes, I did. So what do you do? I cannot cut because it's a DVD, but I'm just puzzled.
Well, I will say that this goes to one of the issues when we're thinking about the culture of film, and the film as a text that embodies, reflects, tries to portray, and portrays with very specific reference to an auteur's, a director's vision. It is not showing us real life. Right. It is.
No, I know.
I know. But the reason I'm saying this is because the interpretive frame that the student has to come at the film from, that we think they're coming at it from, and where they are coming at it from, are often 2 very different things. So one of the ways to frame the whole Kama Sutra thing in such a way that it will maybe not attract that kind of of response from a student, not or provoke that kind of response, is to have some work on the cultural topic of любовь и секс в Советском Союзе beforehand, so that students understand that this was not, you could not walk into any drugstore and buy презервативы, which does not mean preservatives. And there are ways in which you have to do a kind of likbez. So a lot of the documents that I have students reading are about that. And one of the things, at various times, depending on who is teaching the course, I would sometimes have native speakers doing little mini lecции on the subject, or ask the TAs to do that, or I would sometimes give them some set of information, including, for me, the much more important moment is that when they finally do get around to заниматься любовью, they put the mattress on the floor. And that is, a key moment there. And the fact that, I can't get this kind of information. Nobody's going to talk about these subjects with me. I have to rent a room on the sly to make this happen. And a part of it that students really have to work on is that they are living in коммунальные квартиры. And once they understand the nature of the коммуналка, and all of that work kind of sets the context for why it is that Mel's is under the covers. It's not because it's a different cultural context than the students might think there is. Now, I don't know exactly what the students were thinking. You don't know either, except that they were somehow scandalized by it. But I think it's important to get those ideas out and to make sure that there's some kind of framing of it that sets the stage for a non-C1 viewer, for a C2 viewer, to look at that as a document that expresses, reflects certain kinds of realia of the time.
Thank you. We have Alisa. Your hand is up.
Hi, everybody. One thing that I might share in this regard, and this is something that my co-author Isa and I do in our textbook, is that we ask students actually when there are scenes in films that might be traumatizing to the students or troubling or just unfamiliar, we like to ask them to predict the rating of the film after they watch it. And for Styliagi, for instance, Styliagi is 16 plus. And so that kind of offers a cultural context, in my experience, for students to really step back and think, wow, this is appropriate for a 16-year-old, and I, as a 20-year-old or a 21-year-old, am traumatized by it. Sometimes we found it just helps make the discussion less about I didn't like what I see and why didn't I like what I see. So, and it helps students to reflect on their own culture, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
I have a quick question. Actually, it's a general question to everyone, including those authors of these incoming textbooks. How do you choose films? How do you choose films to discuss? Because what I've noticed, the generation is changing. I used to show Shurik 10 years ago, 15 years ago, Kafkazskaya Plenitsa. They don't buy it anymore. They're bored. But it looks like you have to bring new material. You have to bring new films nowadays, and only selected Soviet films still speak to them. Even they don't like Moscow, does not believe in tears. They don't like other stuff. And then I cannot engage them as much if they don't like it. So how do you choose for this new generation of students, your materials, video materials?
I'll let somebody else go first.
I don't know if I've had that experience. I know Ivan Vasilievich is the absolute favorite film in all the classes that I teach. They adore it. I mean, maybe it's Iowa students, right? Maybe it's actually regional. I'm not sure. Moscow Doesn't Believe in Tears, I show every semester. In fact, I'm showing it this semester. I have not had any complaints or people getting bored and I mean, I actually have classes of like this semester, I'm teaching 90 students in that film class. So they're eating up Ivan Vasilievich, all 90 of them. They want more. Moscow Doesn't Believe in Tears again. They seem to like that too. So I'll let other people kind of respond to that. But I wonder if it's regional, Olga.
Maybe Irina Walsh has an answer. Irina.
I not have an answer, but we've done a lot of experimenting with that. And one thing that we that we take with us is we test films, and that's how we know whether the film will work or will not work. For the textbook, we tested, I don't know how many films, but only 6 of them will be in the textbook. We probably tested maybe 12 or 15.
Yeah.
That was one thing. And another thing, we always go from input. So it doesn't have to be an award film, right? It doesn't have to be a box office film, but it has to be a film that students will learn something from and that they can handle from the beginning to the end.
Yeah.
That's my short answer.
I would say that it has to be in some way compelling to the students. So Moskva slezam не верит, brown students hate the hell out of Gosha. I mean, you're not getting them to like him. You are getting them to understand the situation a little bit better once we work on the demographics of post-war USSR. And they understand the proportion of women to men in the society, and they also understand the ages at which women normally married in that period, right? So a lot of it is setting the context, because they think of it from their own, why would a woman want such a person who yells at her and tells her what to do? And it doesn't necessarily occur to them that maybe Katerina is a little bit tired of always being the person that tells other people what to do, because they're young. They haven't necessarily had that experience themselves. So there are personal as well as culturally motivated reasons why they might not like Gosha. But I think for me, a narrative film, for the level of the student, it has to be at a narrative level where the student can do something with it in terms of narration, description. Those have to be there if we're going to work on it in Russian. If it's a documentary film, as my Perestroika is, it's important to me that the historical topic dealt with is something we can approach through a variety of means. And then we also want to think about the level of the students and what we're asking them to do with the film, right? Because students in second year can watch, our students do watch Осенний Marathon after reading День без вранья. And after reading День без вранья, they have a lot of ammunition to describe Buzykin. We don't make them narrate the film. They're not ready to do that in fourth semester, but they can talk a lot about who he is, what kind of person he is.
Okay, we are running out of time, but let's just take a couple questions, people who had their hands up. So easily, and maybe Diana, but very, very briefly.
Well, I don't have a question, so maybe we can leave it for another session about cinema. So yeah, please go ahead, people who want to ask something.
Did you have a comment?
Well, yeah, I had a comment about I wanted just to share my approach to speaking about your question about generations. So I think what Lynne mentioned about the context and knowledge that our students need is very important, because we also discussed 5 C's, so comparisons and the way to show students the way to compare cultures and build these bridges. Sometimes it's very important, because if we mention that, and at least if we watch with students a few Soviet movies, and after that we will show a few contemporary movies, saying and trying to point out the difference in approaches and difference in different generations, to show that actually our cinematography is developing, and USSR collapsed undermined the industry, and many our film directors are actually searching for their own approach. And it's great also to have students who have experience with Italian or German cinematography, and they can bring something saying that sexual sense can be in German cinematography more presented than in Russian. And so building these comparisons helps a lot. And also bridges with American movies that were filmed in 50s, 60s, 70s also helps to show that we are searching for approach. And it's very helpful to see the film as a piece of art of particular author, not just focusing on discussing a horrible sexual or violent scene. I think it's helpful. So it's at least one of my solutions.
Okay, Lee, do you want to say something today, or do you remember we have still tomorrow or next Friday we have Teachers Lounge?
Right.
And
yeah, I had a comment, not a question.
Uh-huh.
I had a comment, not a question. So I can cede to questions.
Okay. So do you want to comment?
Okay, I guess I can comment quickly. And that was just to say, I show Styliagi to high school students and I give them a trigger warning. And at a public high school, you probably would not be allowed to do that. But that is very effective. And I will say that I do think that my students are much less disturbed by Styliagi, even watching in a full room of their peers with their teacher, than they are by Moscow Doesn't Believe in Tears. And I do think like both of those are really important, where the sex scene isn't even really visible, right? But because they call it rape. And so that has been a really important conversation, actually, to have that conversation that no one watching that film in 1980 in Russia would call that rape. And just the whole conversation about cross communication surrounding sexual issues, particularly cross-culturally, because if we're going to send them abroad, obviously things have changed in decades as well, but they need to understand these things. And what I often show them too is Mary Tyler Moore and say that this was a liberated woman in 1980, late 1970s in the US. So getting them to understand, again, as Isa was pointing out, the films are in their historical context and in the historical moment. And like, can you choose a Glasnost Perestroika film without a sex scene? Because that was a big deal, right? And so I do think that when we contextualize it that way, it is helpful. And it also, they can elect not to come if it's uncomfortable. And I suppose you can stop the film at that point and say you can, just know that this is coming. You don't need to watch this part. But having those conversations with students, I think, are essential to them actually understanding the cultural content and how that impacts cross-cultural communication.
Thank you. And Diana will wrap up our meeting with your comment or question.
Yeah.
What do you have?
About Moscow Doesn't Believe in Tears. In my class, I've heard the most passionate, the longest monologue from a lady who couldn't understand why this successful woman needed someone like Gosha. So we actually had the most response to that particular movie than others.
Okay, excellent. So thank you so much, colleagues. But remember, the whole webinar series this semester is built in such a way that we have a follow-up teachers lounge, which will be next Friday at 5 o'clock. So please make sure that you register for it, and we will just continue our conversation. This time it will be more open. We invite more people, and maybe those people who are publishing their textbook can share a little bit more about their approaches on how they work with the media and the visual text. And thank you so much for coming, and let's continue talking next Friday.
Great. And Sunday is at what time also?
And Sunday, I just put another copy of this. So Sunday at 1,
Okay.
For ACTI members, please come for collegial support.
Okay.
Thank you, and a peaceful weekend to everyone as much as it can be possible.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good to see everyone.
See you on Sunday or next Friday.
Yeah. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Ira, stop recording.